I woke up with a fever, so I loaded myself up with conventional psychotropics to come and talk to you about unconventional psychotropics. But that is sort of slightly symbolic because it seemed to me as though it was working within the system to try and change it, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. I am a consultant psychiatrist. I work at the Maudsley and King's College London, which is about 6 miles south of here. I hold a large government grant to investigate the therapeutic efficacy and safety of psilocybin as a treatment for depression. So that's quite a big thing in itself. But I also work with Compass Pathways, and I'm aware that that company has caused quite a lot of opprobrium in the community. So I wanted to come and talk today about psychedelics and the profit motive, and tell you a little bit about what we're doing with the money that Compass give us, and also with the money that UK government give us. And I'm agnostic about the role of the profit motive in psychedelics. I don't know, but what I do know is that the vast majority of drugs that have been developed through to medical licensing have been done with a profit motive. So this is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. Please just put your hand up if you can't hear me at the back, and I have a tendency to quieten down over time. This is what I'm going to talk about. As I say, I think the profit motive is probably necessary for the time being. It may not be in the future, but that regulation is the key to sustainability if the profit motive is there. So, as I say, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm a senior clinical lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry. I lead the Psychedelic Trials Group there, which is essentially a sort of equivalent to Imperial College London. And I set that up with the money I got from UK government via the National Institute for Health Research, and also via the money from Compass. So I'm going to talk to you about how funding for trials works. It's not as simple as government and Compass giving me money. That's not the way it works, and it's set up that way for a reason, because that might sort of corrupt me. I used to work at Imperial. I was one of the clinicians on the Psychedelic pilot before I got my grant. And my clinical interest is in depression, particularly treatment-resistant forms of depression. I have a personal history of depression. So I come at it from quite a personal angle. I found psychedelics very helpful. I also found other forms of treatment very helpful, including SSRIs. So I'm not a psychedelic eulogizer, but on the other hand, I'm not a sort of pharma cynic or an anti-psychiatrist either. I come at this with a passion, but also an agnosticism. I don't know whether this is going to work. I don't know whether psychedelics are scalable into a feasible clinical treatment for lots of people. We will see, but it's a very interesting journey to find out. So, King's College London receives money from Compass and from UK government, NIHR, but I have no financial links to them, and they have no influence over the way I design my studies, or our group designs our studies. I have no financial interest in the development of psilocybin. My salary is paid by you if you are a UK taxpayer, and I'm interested in the molecule and the therapy and the treatment and the patients who suffer, not any financial gain that may or may not occur because of that. This is who we are. At the top is Alan Young. He's a professor of mood disorders at the Institute of Psychiatry. He's been very supportive in allowing this research to develop at the Institute of Psychiatry. And then we have two research coordinators, Catherine and Tim, two psychotherapists, Gemma and Liam, I think are here today, two research nurses, a junior psychiatrist, and last but by no means least, our administrator, who makes everything happen, almost. Okay, so my main point in talking about this is I think targeting the profit motive may be a bit of a red herring, maybe a bit of a distraction from thinking about how we make this how we develop this treatment in the right way. And for that, I think we need to understand our own motivations and the motivations of others in developing this treatment. And that is why the clinical trials process exists. It knows that human beings are altruistically motivated, but also selfishly motivated. And the reason why the clinical trials process exists is to regulate that process and to answer two key questions. Is a drug safe relative to the disease, in inverted commas, that it's designed to treat? And is it effective relative to placebo, the usual passage of time, or to other treatment? I suppose when we think about psychedelics, they're an unusual example because we have millennia of use of psychedelics. So we know they're basically safe if delivered in a safe and supportive context. It's quite tricky to work out whether or not they are effective within this slightly fetishized, randomized clinical trials process that we have to undergo. But that's the situation that we're in. We have to engage with that process in order to evidence a decision of whether or not to give them a medical license. Because if you give them a medical license, you move them out of Schedule 1. And if you move them out of Schedule 1, a whole new vista of research and treatment opportunities open up. And the reason why that whole process is important is that that is a process that governments will engage with. And that is why we're doing it. So whilst I don't see myself as a particular rebel, I'm quite sort of conventionally trained, I do see myself as working within the system to change it. And I think that's probably the right way to do it, and that the profit motive may be a part of that, at least for the time being. Just to say, my experience with Compass has been pretty good so far. I think they have the right personal motivations. Yes, they think about things in a business way, but no, they have not sought to unduly influence me in my work. So yeah, I mean, this is largely what I've been talking about. I hope that we all share a common goal. At the moment, psilocybin is a Schedule 1 drug. It can never be used legally outside of an authorized research study. That's a big problem. The clinical trials process is the only way, historically, aside from cannabis, where a drug has been taken out of Schedule 1. It's the only way. So that's the process that we're going through. That's what Imperial are doing, that's what Newcastle and Manchester are doing, that's what we're doing, that's what various centres in the States and Europe are doing. And it's all in a coordinated effort to try and challenge Schedule 1 designation of psychedelics. And I hope that we can all agree that that is a good thing. And I think what we're talking about is the way we go through that process. I think it's quite different, incidentally, to the idea of how, if you get a license for psychedelics, you deliver them in a sustainable and quality-assured way. I think the key to that is regulation, but it's maybe a talk for another time. I think, for me, the pharma industry often attracts a lot of criticism. It's actually an incredibly tightly regulated industry. The bigger concern for me personally is unregulated commercialized use of psychedelics. We're seeing the development of retreats offering psilocybin experiences, ayahuasca experiences, often for quite large amounts of money. That concerns me because I think within that space if there's the right intention, then that's fine, that's good. But what if there's the wrong intention? And how do you make sure that there isn't? There needs to be a process of regulation, and that's my major point. The clinical trials process is regulated, and it's regulated for a reason, and I'll tell you that in a minute. So this is sort of roughly how much money we get a year. It's neatly divided into public and industry funding, and it's about 600,000, and that basically pays for people's salaries, all the overheads at the institution, the drug, the process of getting the drug to hospital, hiring out the clinical research facility. The costs are endless. But it's not just a case of me getting money. The money goes to King's, the group uses the money, and there's a whole regulatory process within King's that determines how that money is spent. Lots of checks and balances to make sure it's being spent on what we said we would spend it on. And also to separate us from the funders so that we're not unduly influenced by them. So here we are, this is where we are, King's, a few miles south of here. I don't have a pointer, do I? Anyway, that bit on the left, that's where we do the trials. Bit above that is where you can do cool molecular neuroscience. That bit there is where the scanner is, and scan people's brains. That bit there is where the pharmacy is, which has the Schedule 1 license to hold the drug. That's where my office is, and that's where we have our team meetings. And the point of telling you this is that all of that is in 500 meters of it, so we can walk in between those sites. And that makes King's quite unique. We have everything that we need to do these trials on one campus. So this bit here where we do the trials looks a bit like this. This is a photo from our Healthy Volunteers trial, which we will shortly announce the results of later this year. It's the largest ever Healthy Volunteers trial with psilocybin, and in it we demonstrate the feasibility of group administration of the drug. There's also a cognitive study, and thinking about what the previous speaker was talking about in terms of the difficulties of training therapists, this was a vehicle for training therapists. So therapists had the opportunity to both participate in this trial and also be trained as a psilocybin therapist in this trial. And it's the only legal way you can do it because of the Schedule 1 status. So it's sowing a seed. It's sort of training the trainers of tomorrow. This is what we do. This is the basic structure of any randomized controlled trial. They're actually incredibly simple, but really difficult to do well. You recruit your patients, you measure whatever you like. At the moment, we're principally interested in safety and whether people get better from their depression. And then you randomize people. Use a random process to determine whether or not they get psilocybin and psychological support or placebo and psychological support. And then you measure again, and you compare between groups. And that's the only way you can answer those two basic questions. Is a drug safe relative to the risks of the disease? Is the drug effective relative to the passage of time or other treatments? And it is legally mandated, and there are a series of trials that you have to go through in order to achieve medical licensing. They take a long time, and they're very expensive. And with psilocybin, we're sort of halfway through, in the middle of phase 2. And the reason why that process exists is this, thalidomide. Actually a very effective drug for some things, but it was developed at a time when drug regulation was lax, and it was marketed as a morning sickness treatment, and it resulted in thousands of children being born with limb deformities. You can see here, called phocomelia. And the public outcry over that led to the 1962 drug amendments, and this legally mandated this clinical trials process that we work with now. So the point is that society has demanded this process, and this is the process that we are going through, but it is very expensive. And that is why that governments have historically handed this over to a profit-driven pharmaceutical industry to do. And the idea is that by generating capital, you incentivize development, you then fund the clinical trials, you evidence medical licensing, you then have a period of market exclusivity in which you can sell your treatment without competition. Then that patent expires, it becomes generic, and competition reduces the cost. But the idea is that the circle is a sort of positive feedback cycle that incentivizes further development. But it's very, very expensive. The average amount a pharma company spends to get a drug to market is $350 million. And the reason why it costs so much, not just because of the complexity of the trials, is because so many drugs fail. Psilocybin, MDMA, different case. It's probably going to cost less to get them to market because we're already pretty sure that they work, but we still have to go through this process. But still, where's the money going to come for that? Compass were a not-for-profit but changed to a for-profit in order to attract capital investment. And indeed, they do have the money required to do these trials. So, perhaps a necessary evil. I leave that up to you to decide. So this is the process of challenging Schedule 1 via the clinical trials process. You go through this series of trials, and if at any point you fail, you go back to the start. And funds permitting, you try again. And you can see where we are with psilocybin. So we've still got a number of steps to go through, but this is the process that has the authority to challenge the legal status. I'll take questions at the end, if that's okay. But you can't do these trials without this. And this is what Compass produce. It's a polypropylene bottle with 5 capsules in it. And when the patient shakes the capsules out into their hand, they can't tell whether it's psilocybin or placebo. And neither can I. So whilst there are the inevitable problems with blinding with psychoactive drugs, it is a blinded trial to the extent that the regulators and governments will engage with that process. So we have 3 trials ongoing at the moment. The healthy volunteer trial I already mentioned that demonstrates the feasibility of group administration. It's a cognitive study looking at changes in cognitive and emotional processing pre and post psilocybin and between placebo and different doses of psilocybin. But it was also a training vehicle for therapists to act as therapists for the treatment-resistant depression trial, which we just started. It's a phase 2b dose-finding study, so it's designed to disambiguate between a 10 milligram dose and a 25 milligram dose in terms of those 2 questions, safety and efficacy. That's a big study. That's multi-center all around Europe and the US, very expensive. And we just started. I think we've recruited about 10 people in total of the 216. Very complex, huge amounts of oversight. Healthy volunteers trials are much easier. When it comes to patients, much more bureaucracy, much more oversight, for good reasons. And then my UK government-funded trial, a phase 2 feasibility trial, which will compare psilocybin versus true placebo in 60 people. And Johnny and Roberta were talking about the disappointment that people, half the people would get, being on placebo. And partly in response to that, I added an open label extension to this trial after 6 weeks where everyone gets a dose. And I hope it all gets authorized, but the point is to sort of give everyone a bite of the cherry. It seems fair to me. But also it's also about repeated dosings. And what the ideal time period is. We don't have much data on that. We also have very little data on people who are on antidepressants and take psychedelics. The anecdotal evidence is that it attenuates the effect, but we don't have any objective data about that. So it's a sort of exploratory trial in that sense, but it's also designed to answer these 2 key questions, safety via efficacy, by having a randomization between true placebo and a treatment dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams. And we also do brain scans and collect blood samples and analyze therapeutic relationships, that sort of thing. Should be interesting. Other activities of our group, patient acceptability work, systematic reviews and grant proposals in other areas. Again, there's a quite sort of prescribed process of justifying to grant funders that there is an area that you should explore. So if I want to explore a trial in anxiety disorders, I need to go to patients with an anxiety disorder and say, do you think this is a good idea? Collect data on that and use that to justify funding for a pilot trial. and then use that to justify funding for a phase 2 trial, and then a phase 3 trial. That's the way it works. We're developing psilocybin therapist training and accreditation with Compass. That's at a very early stage at the moment. And we have a sort of active patient, public, and clinician engagement series of events. I do various media interviews and talks. And we also hold a monthly psychedelic integration group where people can come and talk about their use of psychedelic drugs, their experiences, perhaps on the trial, perhaps in recreational use, in a safe and confidential setting. So a few pictures of what we've been up to. So we're trying to engage with this problem from many different perspectives, both by collecting the scientific evidence, but also by engaging with the rest of society. I know here I'm sort of preaching to the converted. It's easy. Actually, the much harder conversation is out there and challenging decades of stigma. These are all our relationships, not too interesting, really. Already talked about that. So, summary. It was society that demanded this process, and it demanded it for a good reason. It wanted safe and effective drugs to salve ills. But in order to do that well, it costs a lot of money, and historically, the profit motive has been a part of that. Compass are unique because they have developed psilocybin through the GMP manufacturing process to the quality required for a medicine. And they've also, at the same time, manufactured matching placebo capsules. And that allows us to do these randomized controlled trials. I know that Usona are now manufacturing psilocybin as well, and that's great. Competition is good. But when I was doing my grant proposals, Compass were the only people you could get the drug from. To be fair to them, they give it to us for nothing. They don't charge for it because obviously they want to incentivize research. And as I've said, this clinical trials process can challenge Schedule 1 designation. If we challenge Schedule 1 designation, then a whole new vista of research and treatment opportunities open up. But I think the harder process at that point is delivering quality psilocybin therapy to people who need it in a safe, regulated way. I think that's a much harder process, actually, than getting this drug through the clinical trials process. As I say, my own view is the profit motive is currently necessary. It's probably not sufficient part of the overall process, and I don't know whether or not it will be necessary in the future. But that process of accreditation and regulation all costs money. Where's that going to come from? My final slide is that where we do our trials at King's is great, but there's no access to nature. And what I'd love to be able to do is have a psychedelic treatment centre down at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, which is where the word Bedlam comes from. And it's the original old asylum. Its history goes back to the 11th century. And it's beautiful. And it's still a working psychiatric hospital, and it's set in 200 acres of grounds that are looked after by a charity. So if anyone's got a spare £10 million, then do let me know, and I'll make this happen, I promise. And at that point, I will stop, and we've got a few minutes for questions. Thank you very much.